Greetings, everybody. My name is Jean Bajalan, and welcome to This is Revolution. I am standing in for Jason Miles tonight, who is extremely busy. Why is Jason busy? Well, he is preparing for the LA Live Show, which will be this Sunday in Telegram Ballroom in Los Angeles. There is information about tickets to the event, and Jason is hoping that many of you will be there to see all the wonderful guests that we have, including C. Derek Vaughn, the Left Reckoning Boys, Ben Burgess, Deep State Cuba, and a whole load of other people. So hopefully we will be seeing some of you there. Well, you won't be seeing me because I won't be there, and you won't be seeing Pascal because he won't be there. But you will get to see Jason and Cuba. So well worth a trip if you can. Another important thing, if you have the time, please consider liking and subscribing to our channel. Everything you do with the liking, subscribing, hitting the bell helps the channel grow, helps us develop, and helps us keep bringing the content that you all apparently like to you. And well, one of the guests on Sunday will be Daniel Bessner, and tonight we have a special guest. Daniel Bessner is the host of American Prestige podcast, and we'll be talking to his co-host, or maybe he's Daniel Bessner's co-host, or Daniel Bessner is his co-host. I don't know who's the sidekick in the relationship, but one of them is the sidekick. And we have David Davidson today, who is the other half of American Prestige, to talk about American foreign policy. But of course, it is not just boring old me here today. We have, of course, the other half of This is Revolution, the more handsome half, the more intellectual half, the half who was on Deutsche Welle today talking about the crisis in Haiti. It is the one, the only Pascal Robert. Hi, Pascal. How you doing?
Peace and greetings to the chat, the audience, and to you, Gene Bajlan. Thank you for not for having me on, but for that wonderful introduction. Yes, I was on Deutsche Welle talking about Haiti and what's going on there. If you can check that out, probably on PBS tonight. As a matter of fact, you get also to announce that Jason should be on Majority Report this Friday.
Is it this Friday? Is that in the fun half?
Correct. So you guys should be able to check Jason out there. I'm thinking about doing a special with Paul McComb and another friend of mine on the Haiti situation. Let me know in the chat if you guys would be interested in having. That might be a Mau Mau. That actually might be the last Mau Mau of this month.
That sounds like a great idea.
That might be on the situation in Haiti. And I might invite Paul McComb with I can get another guest as well to do that. So let us know in the comments if you'd be interested in the Mau Mau Hour being dedicated to the affair going on in Haiti right now.
Yeah, I think that would be definitely an interesting topic to cover. A lot of news coming out of Haiti at the moment, and of course, you and your coterie of Haitian experts will probably provide fantastic coverage for everybody. So everybody message Pascal on Twitter and tell him he needs to do a special Mau Mau Hour on Haiti. But with that said, as I mentioned at the top, we have a fantastic guest today. We have Derek Davidson from the American Prestige podcast. He is Daniel Bessner's sidekick. He is here to talk foreign policy. We're going to cover a lot of topics today, but we wanted to start off talking about Saudi Arabia and oil, which is an important news story. But I feel, Pascal, it's kind of going under the radar with a lot of other things happening in the world. What are your thoughts?
I think that one of the most fascinating things about the Biden presidency is the churn of events around the relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia that no one is talking about out loud.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. So to help elucidate this situation, here is Derek Davidson. Hey, Derek, welcome to This is Revolution.
Guys. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for agreeing to come on. Well, before we begin, who would you say is the sidekick, you or Daniel? Like, which superheroes would you? Since
I think
everything,
we're kind of a switch actually. Sometimes he's more the sidekick. Sometimes I'm more the sidekick. We go back and forth.
oh, so
It's a pretty equitable, in my opinion. It's a pretty equitable division of I don't know what you want to call it, labor, I guess.
brains and beauty. Who's brains and who's beauty? Well, there we go. That's maybe too
On
much.
both of those, I
Both.
mean,
Okay,
that's clear.
fair enough. Well, let's get right to brass tacks today. Let's hit the nail on the head and start on our topic. We wanted to talk to you, of course, because American Prestige, and your newsletter, Foreign Policy Exchanges, they cover a lot of issues related to American foreign policy. From a perspective, I would say, and I think you might agree with me on this, is not the Beltway insider approach to foreign policy, but at the same time, it is not the kind of inverted American exceptionalism, anti-imperialism that we see on the left. Instead, it's a kind of more nuanced realism, kind of realistic look at foreign policy, warts and all. And one of the issues, as we said at the top here, was Saudi Arabia, the relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia, and particularly the tug of war taking place over oil production, and Saudi Arabia apparently standing up, quote unquote, to America, which wants to see an increase in oil production. Can you talk to this situation in a general sense? What is going on with American-Saudi relations?
So, I mean, this goes back to the decision by OPEC Plus, which is a block. I mean, people are familiar, I assume, with OPEC. World's major oil producers are in a sort of cartel to control prices. It's been that way for decades now. In recent years, they've put together this more expanded block called OPEC Plus that is mostly OPEC plus Russia, but there are a couple of other kind of oil producers in there as well. The decision that they made as a unit during or fairly soon after the onset of COVID, not quite at the beginning. It was after a little bit of misstep, I think, on the Saudis' part. But they made the decision to drastically cut oil production, recognizing that everybody's economy was shutting down and we were going into some uncharted territory. With COVID, I hesitate to say the pandemic is ending or decreasing in any way. I mean, it's still very much there, but governments making the decision basically to come out of lockdowns to try and get back to something approaching normal economic activity. There's been pressure from the United States, from other countries that are, looking at global oil prices, at global energy prices, would like to see them come down. There's been some pressure on the bloc to get back to pre-COVID levels as quickly as possible. OPEC Plus is instead for a couple of, about a year, maybe a year and a half now, had been taking a very slow approach to kind of every month adding a little bit more capacity back, but being very cautious not to flood the market. There was a concern about flooding the market, crashing prices again, and none of the oil producers in that block wanted that. What's happened over the last couple of months is that OPEC Plus has made what the Saudis insist and what the bloc insists is an economic decision, fearing that we're on the brink of a global recession. That things are taking a downturn, that oil demand may take a downturn. They made a decision to cut production again, to stop this kind of slow but steady increase. So last month, they cut production by about 100,000 barrels per month. Earlier this month, they cut production by a collective 2 million barrels per day moving forward, starting in November and moving forward. The Biden administration, through all of this, kind of staring the midterm elections in the face, worrying about $5 a gallon gasoline and up, has been trying to push the Saudis to, because the Saudis are really, along with Russia, one of the two most influential players, trying to push them, and the only one that really has additional capacity, I should say, to kind of bring to market. But they've been pushing the Saudis to expand production more quickly. And now this cut, runs completely counter to what the Biden administration wanted. The war in Ukraine adds a whole nother dimension to this because it's, sort of viewed as a gift to the Russians to keep oil prices high, so that Russian, oil revenue will continue to be high, even with the Russians selling a lot of their oil at a discount. If the overall price is high, they can still make a fair amount of money on that. So that compounds this kind of request for the Saudis to, take it easy, to bring the oil production back on so we can get cheaper gas. Now it's also, this you're with us or against us mentality with the Ukraine war. You're either going to do what we want and bring more oil back on market, or you're going to cut and help the Russians, and we can't abide that. So that's basically the framing here for what's going on.
Well, Derek, that's really interesting to get to the brass tacks in terms of the immediate cause of what's happening with oil, with the oil prices. But what's more interesting to me is the overall history of what between the fall of the Trump administration and the incoming of the Biden administration has seemed to be a complete and total utter change in the nature of the relationship between the United States and the House of Saud, or Saudi Arabia, if you will. Now, a lot of this, some have speculated, has to do with the relationship with the United States and Saudi Arabia in terms of the Yemeni conflict, whether or not the United States is whether or not to be supporting the Saudis with a proxy war in Yemen by sending them military weaponry. A lot of people are also saying that what is the role of the Gamal Khashoggi, the known journalist that was basically alleged by some to have been assassinated by the leader of the House of Saud right now, the current president, who was considered the current leader or king, if you will, who was considered to be a reformer. So all of these various kind of machinations, if you will, how is this playing out in terms of how Biden is dealing with the Saudi royal family?
So yeah, there's a lot that's been
the king himself.
There's a lot that's been going on in this relationship, and you can go all the way back to the Saudi intervention in Yemen in 2015, which happened around the same time that the U.S. was negotiating the nuclear deal with Iran, which has since been scrapped. The Obama administration at the time, I think, made the calculation that if they helped the Saudis, they helped support the Saudi war effort in Yemen, that it would sort of ease the sting of the U.S. engaging in negotiations with Iran and lifting sanctions on Iran, which is what happened as part of that deal. The Trump administration that came into office, and Donald Trump, for whatever reason, was enthralled to the Saudis, just loved Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince, loved the whole family. It was his first overseas trip, and he danced around with the sword and all that nonsense. And he, of course, in 2018 scrapped the nuclear deal and drastically ratcheted up U.S. support for the war in Yemen. So that's all been going on here, and kind of politically in the United States, the Saudi relationship, because Trump was so tight with them, I think took on a more partisan characteristic than it had previously. So then you had Biden, and of course, as you mentioned, the murder of Jamal Khashoggi in 2018 woke a lot of people up who were kind of sleepwalking through, I think, the Yemen war. But a lot of columnists and reporters and journalists at major outlets who knew Khashoggi and certainly knew of him since he was a columnist for the Washington Post, kind of woke up to this idea that maybe this Mohammed bin Salman guy isn't so great. The U.S. intelligence community has concluded that Mohammed bin Salman ordered that assassination, that he ordered them to murder Khashoggi in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. So that really affected a lot of public opinion. Then you have Biden running in the 2020 campaign, talking about kind of repudiating Trump's relationship with the Saudis, talking about how he was going to hold them accountable. He was going to make Mohammed bin Salman a pariah. He was going to make the whole Saudi state a pariah. Came into office and did none of that. Instead, we went through a year plus of the Biden administration, not really breaking all that significantly with the Trump administration's foreign policy in the Middle East, and instead trying to convince the Saudis that, hey, I mean, we're not Trump, we're not going to be your best friend, but we're still the United States. Nothing's fundamentally changed about this relationship. That culminated earlier this year, and I think July, I think, when Biden visited Saudi Arabia. He had his famous fist bump with the Crown Prince, and that a whole trip was about kind of reassuring the Saudis, the UAE, Israel, that the U.S. was still maintaining the same foreign policy that it always had been. That whole process, and the fact that he sort of, I mean, I think at this point maybe humiliated himself would not be, overstating it, by going over there and kind of paying fealty to the Saudis, only to have them now, undertake this significant oil cut at a time when the United States really, or the Biden administration and Democrats really don't want to see that happen, is maybe adding to the sense of bitterness here. Like, look at what we put out for you guys, and this is how you repay us. I think that plays into a lot of these bad feelings that you're seeing from Washington.
I think this is an extremely important point to emphasize. When we talk about American foreign policy, very rarely do we see major titanic shifts between administrations. Usually there is some level of continuity, even with Donald Trump, who did some things that the foreign policy establishment found extremely reckless, most notably pulling out of the Iran deal. Even he was a continuation of foreign policy, because at the end of the day, the people executing on foreign policy are the same set of people who work for other Republican administrations. They're drawing on the same pool. But it strikes me that Joe Biden has, in a sense, got the worst of both worlds, in the sense that he has made a lot of rhetorical moves against Saudi Arabia. He's talked a big game against Saudi Arabia, but once he assumed power, the momentum of the American foreign policy establishment, all the different tentacles and relationships that exist on so many different levels between the United States and Saudi Arabia, they've all remained largely intact, largely functioning in the same ways as they had done before, except Joe Biden has shouted a lot of stuff about MBS, and has alienated the Saudis. And in a kind of personalized regime like that, that matters when you have a significant degree of political power in the hands of one man and one elite whose personal disposition towards you can lead to important policy shifts. So, with that in mind, would you say then that this refusal to increase oil production at the behest of the United States is a direct result of that? OPEC is saying it's an economic move, but would you say it's an economic move, or do you think this is the Saudis, as they do periodically? Saudi Arabia is often called a client state of the United States or something like that, but sometimes the tail wags the dog, and these important client states, whether it's Saudi Arabia, whether it's Israel, whether it's Turkey, all these states have an ability, the relationship is two ways. They have an ability to mess with the United States. So would you say this is a political move? Is this an attempt to get the Democrats out of office to have a more favorable Republican administration?
So, I mean, there's a few things going on here. And I think one is, you're right to note that there's been a lot of rhetoric, or there was a lot of rhetoric from the Biden campaign that did not play out. It has not played out in the Biden presidency. I think the best example of that is not the Saudis directly, but it has to do with Iran and restoring the nuclear deal, which could have been done on day one, but the Biden administration has pretty much frittered that away. But I think there's a couple of things going on with respect to the Saudis. One is, it is a personalized regime, but it's gotten even more personalized. I mean, MBS has sidelined cousins. He's sidelined, anybody who could be perceived as a potential rival. He's really, even within that system, kind of distilled things down to a very kind of one man, one rule type of relationship in a way that, it's there's been more input from the other parts of the family in the past in the way that Saudi does things. But yeah, I mean, I think, how do I want to put this? It is, there is, I'm certain, a level of offense that MBS has taken to the things that Joe Biden said on the campaign trail, to the treatment that he's gotten, that he got after the Khashoggi killing, that where he was sort of shunned for a while before he kind of, he was a little bit welcomed back in. I also think that this is, partly a function of the fact that the United States is no longer the only player in town when it comes to kind of great power competition in the Middle East. China is also there as another potential patron. And even Russia, although it is not economically speaking a great power when it comes to oil. I mean, the Saudis went through an oil price war with the Russians, back, maybe at this point a decade ago or so, and it didn't go well. And I think they recognize that they don't want to do that again. It really, I mean, it caused them. They flooded the market and dropped prices drastically, and they don't want to do that again. That was not a good time for them. I know there's been reporting in The Intercept, for example, about this being, really just a direct attack on Biden, an effort to get Republicans into Congress and you kind of shift the politics in Washington. I wouldn't say that's out of the question, although I'm not sure that this is the thing that keeps MBS up at night. Which party is in control of the U.S. Congress. I definitely think there's a political angle to this, which is sort of testing the boundaries of the U.S. Saudi relationship and questioning whether, for the Saudis, it makes sense to do what the Biden administration wants when they have these other interests that involve these other powers. So I think that does reflect some political sensibility. In terms of the economics, the explanation that they've offered, the explanation that the Saudis have offered and that OPEC Plus has offered isn't entirely credible to me, because there is no indication at this point that the oil market is slackening. The prices had come down from like $120 a barrel, when they spiked after Russia invaded Ukraine. They've come down to like $80-90 a barrel, which is lower certainly, but it's a fairly normal range for oil prices the last few years, and certainly something the Saudis have been able to live with for a while now. So I don't see any indication that they needed economically to make this cut to stave off some kind of crash in oil prices. And you can always, OPEC Plus meets once a month to decide what their output is going to be moving forward. If prices crash today, they could just decide in 2 weeks to cut production. So there's not like there would be this huge lag time for them in terms of a glut of oil on the market. So it's not entirely, the economic explanation seems like a cover to some degree for the political.
So if the economics is a cover for the political, is it safe to say that perhaps, even though the Saudis may not be necessarily interested in full out and out regime change in the eyes of the Democratic Party under the stewardship of Joe Biden, that they are interested in putting pressure on the regime to basically say, like, get off our lawn, Joe, and stop trying to bark orders at us about how we deal with the situation in either Yemen or our oil prices, and dictating to us how we deal with the Chinese or the Russians. Is that possibly the play they're trying to make here? And in terms of the long-term history, there has, in terms of back in the good old days before the war on terror, there was the perception that the Republicans were more amenable to dealing with the Saudis than the Democrats. There was a kind of the perception with the Bush administration and all of that they were more, the Republican Party was the party of the oil interests. That was the perception back in the days of the traditional kind of old school foreign policy, I would say, up until the Gulf War. But I would also agree with you, Derek, that those those types of traditional kind of allegiances have kind of been frayed in this more tumultuous body politic. So, what do you think is their ultimate political goal here? If we see that there's not much justification economically for making this move.
I think you're right. I think it's a shot across the bow in a sense. Again, I don't. I'm not entirely convinced that uh, the Saudis care who's in control of Congress, which party is in control of Congress. They may prefer the Republicans, but I don't know that they would base oil policy, which is, after all, fundamental to the kingdom's economy. I don't know that they would jerk the market around just to get a change in power in DC. Maybe at the presidential level, but I struggle with that at the congressional level. But I do think that there is, basically a warning shot fired here to the United States to say, look, we don't, we don't need you all as much as we used to. We do a lot more business with China in terms of oil sales. Conceivably, they could start buying their military equipment from China. That would be a big expense for them to switch over entirely, because so much of their military is armed by the United States, and you kind of get locked into a relationship in that sense. But there's a here there are other interests at play, that their relationship, somewhat of a counterweight to the U.S., that their relationship with Russia, again, to avoid any kind of oil price war, is more vital in a sense to them than their relationship with the United States is at this point. So yeah, I do think that there's some effort to kind of wave a flag here at the U.S. and say our own thing, and there's not much that you can do.
So at best, the political aspect in terms of them trying to get Joe Biden back, that's perhaps like a bonus on top of a whole host of factors which are driving this policy. It's not the driving policy in any sense. Like MBS might be happy that this hurts Joe Biden because Joe Biden was mean about him, but this is not the cause of the policy change. So I kind of want to flip the script then. What about the United States? Every so often we hear people both on the right and the left complaining about the American dependence and relationship on Saudi Arabia. I mean, Congress even voted to, stop backing the war in Yemen. That was, of course, vetoed by Trump. So there is some hostility towards Saudi Arabia in certain quarters of the American political establishment, and not just outlying people, but people who are actually in the establishment who are concerned about how this relationship is developing. What are the possibilities of any kind of even, shift in an American disposition towards Saudi Arabia? Is there going to be an untangling? And some people argue, for example, the Iran nuclear deal and an attempt to open Iran up to Western capitalism, open Iran up to the Western oil markets. That was in part a play to reduce dependency on Saudi Arabia, to have a more balanced Gulf policy vis-a-vis these two countries and the oil question, and have another major producer on the world market come online, a producer that has its oil infrastructure hamstrung by sanctions and so on and so forth. So in what sense might we see any kind of shift in American policy? And if not, if we don't see that, are there any preconditions, you would say, any things that would have to change in the Middle East more generally for such a shift to even become a feasible policy, even if it's not feasible at the moment?
I mean, I think the two biggest shifts you could make directly in terms of the oil market would be, and you could, I mean, you could do this evening if Joe Biden wanted to, is to lift sanctions on Venezuela and Iran. These are two major oil producers that have had their oil industries completely smothered by U.S. sanctions. If you wanted to bring a lot of oil back online very quickly and affect the market, and also reduce dependence on Saudi. And when I say dependence, it's not that the United States imports a ton of Saudi oil. We do not, but we are all participating in this global oil market that determines prices and determines things like
I think
price at pump.
that's an important point to emphasize here, because I don't think a lot of people realize that because oil is a globally traded commodity, its price is affected by the global supply. The United States, though, produces enough oil for its own internal consumption primarily. Most of the Saudi oil is going to Asia and Europe.
Right. And you could yeah, I mean, Biden, I think he already announced, maybe it was today, another dip into the strategic petroleum reserve to try and stabilize prices, which is a short-term measure. It could, kind of stopgap through the campaign, but at some point that's going to run out, or you're going to get to a level that is not viable. It's not viable as a strategy anymore. I don't see any indication that the relationship is changing, and I'll tell you the reason why, and the area to watch is the military context. And this was, as recently as yesterday, I think in the Washington Post, there was a piece quoting, some unspecified Pentagon folks that basically, despite all this rhetoric and despite the hostility especially emanating from Congress and from some potential places in Congress. I mean, Bob Menendez is the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. You've had, high-ranking Democrats in other parts of the Senate, talking about freezing weapons sales and freezing military cooperation. There's no indication yet that the Biden administration is even considering pulling the trigger on anything like that. So I don't really see the kind of momentum going in the direction of fundamentally changing the relationship. I know there's the rhetoric out of the White House has been, well, the president wants to be very deliberate about this. He wants to be very methodical in his decision making. I think what he wants is to get as much distance from the oil cut as possible, and then kind of just leave things unchanged, which has been sort of the story of this administration in the Middle East from the beginning.
So you think that Biden basically wants to go back to the status quo ante instead of having to deal with all of this changing on the ground?
I think it's not a priority for them. They've made it clear that the region, that changing anything fundamental about the way that the U.S. approaches the Middle East is not something that they're prepared to do. Whether it's getting back into the Iran deal, which again could have been a day one decision, whether it's changing the relationship with Saudi Arabia or the UAE, whether it's even looking at more peripheral countries that have lousy human rights records and things that, with the administration talking about how we want to put human rights at the center of U.S. foreign policy. You look at Egypt, we're not even really willing to do something to change U.S. aid to Egypt, which is one of the worst performing human rights regimes in the world. I just don't think they view it as a priority or as something that they're willing to take any risk of a political cost for making any substantive changes. And that's especially true now with the war in Ukraine and kind of sucking up all the attention, all the oxygen.
Well, that's a really fascinating assessment. I really want to ask you about that. Is that, do you believe that in the wake of the 20-plus year war on terror, that there's actually an ideological move being made upon foreign policy elites at a high level in the United States to basically pivot away from the Middle East and the Muslim world as a subject matter du jour of focus and concentrate on other areas, maybe pivot to Asia or Eurasia or otherwise, because frankly, the in light of what has happened in the Middle East, the debacle is just too much to even weather anymore.
I think there's definitely a desire to pivot, at least in terms of what the discourse is about, what we're talking about, and what we're sort of focusing on. And to some degree that plays out in things like the national strategy document that the administration just released, or in terms of military budgets that seem more focused on kind of heavy weapons platforms of the sort that you might use in a superpower conflict with a peer like China. I definitely think there's at least a desire to shift at that level. I don't think disengagement is necessarily where the foreign policy elite is at in terms of the Middle East, but just kind of, again, there's just there doesn't seem to be any appetite for the kind of investment of time, energy, political capital, whatever you want to call it, that it would take to change the I would say completely broken, and has been broken for 25, 30 years now at least, if not longer, U.S. approach to the Middle East. It's just on autopilot in a sense.
Would you say, for example, some of the zeal that we saw at the beginning of the 2000s, the belief that the application of American military, diplomatic, and political power to the Middle East might bring about a kind of political transformation in the region, that these countries will be turned into liberal democracies that also will open up and have lots of opportunities for American business and become stable capitalist countries and useful allies of the United States? That zeal has kind of completely died, and is now, there's a kind of realism towards the Middle East that, as much as, let's say, the liberal and conservative wings of the foreign policy establishment might find certain regimes distasteful or crude, or you wouldn't bring them to your family home for dinner, you wouldn't talk about them in polite company, but we have to do business with these people. We have to do business with Erdogan. We have to do business with Sisi. We have to do business with the Saudis, and we'll just do what we do, and we'll return to a kind of more cynical age where you had good guys and bad guys, and everyone was really a bad guy, but then there were our bad guys and their bad guys. And so people can rightly complain about the regime in Iran and Khamenei and how terrible the Islamic Republic is, but even MBS, when he first did his debutante ball, was getting glowing Thomas Friedman endorsements, and was being feted by the foreign policy.
Reformer with results.
Reformer with results, yeah, with the machete results.
Yeah, exactly.
Machete results. That is results of a certain time. But the notion that we've had the failed interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan, nation building was utterly disastrous. The Arab Spring turned out to be a disaster. Interventions in Libya were a failure. The Syrian civil war has been a total mess and has helped destabilize Europe. So would you say the American foreign policy establishment in general, with its posture to the Middle East, is now retreating to a kind of like, if it's not broken, we're not going to think about it. We're not going to have any grand ideas.
It is kind of broken, but we're not going to break it any. We don't want to break it any further. Maybe, yeah.
Yeah, would you say there's a kind of a shift in attitudes in that sense?
I mean, I think it's broader than just the Middle East. I think there's a real zeal to get back to a global akin to the Cold War, and that's why we've created this. Don't call it a Cold War with China. Because that's just it. I think for the U.S. security establishment, it makes more sense. And this is an establishment that struggled for, what's it been, 30 years, give or take, since the end of the actual Cold War, to find a purpose, and not just a purpose for having a Pentagon or a Defense Department, but for a purpose for having a Pentagon that has 750 military bases around the world, a purpose for having a Pentagon that gets $850 billion a year budgets and up. That $850 billion is just the sort of top line that everybody knows about. It's probably over $1 trillion when you add everything in. The zeal for that kind of stuff, for the big deals with defense contractors to build planes that don't work and aircraft carriers that don't really work. it all makes more sense in the architecture of a Cold War type rivalry with a peer, a perceived peer competitor, and that's where this kind of lust for conflict with China, where we keep insisting we don't want a conflict, we actually want to work together because of climate change and pandemics, and we have to collaborate. But in the meantime, everything we do speaks to conflict and competition. I think that's where it comes from. It just the system works better under that design than it did in the unipolar 90s, when it was like, maybe we could do humanitarian interventions around the world that didn't really get the kind of traction that they needed, or the war on terror even, which was a bit more kind of amenable to that structure, but still I don't think was ideal for them. The notion of this new massive global competition with another big competitive country is more appealing, I think.
Hold on, Derek. You're dropping a major. This is a major insinuation you're making here. This is not insignificant. You're basically saying that in the face of the failure of the war on terror and the inability to really recast the scene in the 90s, that the United States on a foreign policy level is aspiring to move back to a Cold War paradigm with China, with communist China as the fulcrum of the opposition. That's your position.
That's my position. I don't think it's feasible. I don't think the model works because this is something that Danny's talked about on our show, and I agree with him. The economies of these two countries are too intertwined to actually get to the kind of first world, second world. Everybody kind of masses up behind the lines and in their own camps structure of the Cold War in the in the 20th century. But I think that for purposes of maintaining a $1 trillion+ national security state, at least creating the impression of a kind of existential conflict with China is much better for that system. It greases the wheels in a much more effective way than anything that we've tried since 1990.
So it's it's a simulacra of a Cold War, like as an organizing mechanism of global affairs and the execution of foreign policy. Even if there isn't a Cold War, they need a Cold War. Otherwise, it's less about actually having a war with China. And I think this is an important point to note. Like neoliberalism as a policy would not have been possible without the massive exploitation of Chinese labor, Chinese industrialization, Chinese capitalism, and the flooding of the American market with cheap consumer goods that could offset the decline of a welfare state. These societies aren't just trading with each other, their social models depend on each other. The American neoliberal model requires a China to provide the cheap consumer goods that Americans like to buy at Walmart, Target, and any number of other shops and stores around the United States of America, because they sure as hell aren't making them in America anymore. But even if that doesn't exist, the interests, you're saying, within the state, they don't necessarily really want a war with China, but they need the perception of a war or a potential war with China in order to keep extracting resources from the American treasury to justify their continued existence. So a lot of the hot rhetoric you sometimes hear about China is less for Chinese consumption, but rather for the consumption of American politicians, so that when that defense budget increase comes along, they'll vote for that defense budget increase. Whereas in reality, American capital and the American bourgeoisie have a very ambivalent relationship to China because they want to exploit China. And if there's a war, they're not going to be able to have access to that huge $1 billion+ market.
Well,
I think that's right. Yeah. Oh, sorry, Pascal. Go ahead.
I'm advocating that the United States wants an actual hot war with China by any stretch of the imagination. What I'm saying is that what's important about what Derek is saying is that America as a foreign policy establishment is looking for a rebrand, if you will, after I would argue two abysmal failures. One being the war on terror, and one being the end of history period of the '90s. And the next rebrand is going to be some kind of Cold War where I think China and maybe China and Russia all put together, bring back the old bad old guys, if you will, and under some kind of guise of a red enemy. And I know we have enough old bad '80s movies to show in reboot to make that happen. But it's interesting to think this is the first time I'm thinking about the rebranding effort in those terms. I mean, yeah, I mean, people listen. Rand Corporation issued a white paper in 2016 talking about the coming war on China. I mean, what the Rand Corporation issues a white paper about, well, how much you want to pay attention to that about is up to you. But I found it interesting. I was like, well, what is this about? Like, why would you want to issue something like that at that particular time? You have Trump coming into office. Trump, increases all of this rhetorical flourish about China and business doesn't do anything realistically, but yet Biden doesn't pivot away from the antagonism with China as well. So in my mind, I'm like, maybe it makes sense.
I mean, it's led under Biden to me to some incoherent places. I mean, this national security strategy document that they just put out was a mess. I mean, it's on the one hand, we're in competition with China. We didn't choose it. We don't want it. But we are unfortunately just inevitably competing with China, and there is this kind of structure. But we don't want a Cold War, and we really want to collaborate with China because of climate change. And I think the administration on some level gets that it has to say these things because its base is attuned to the notion that on some level is attuned to the notion that the biggest threats we face are things like pandemics and climate change that don't cut across, don't kind of divide on national lines and don't make for a very good kind of bipolar model of conflict, global conflict that instead cut across every country and demand collaboration. But at the same time, there is this desire to set China up as the boogeyman. And yeah, with Russia now, which they've sort of played into with by invading Ukraine. Russia is this sort of satellite, number two baddie or whatever, and it does lead to some really, I think, incoherent kind of national orientations. Like, are we competing with these guys? Are we trying to work with them? How are you trying to work with them at the same time that you're you're imposing sanctions on the chip industry and doing things to kind of try to undermine the Chinese economy, but at the same time you turn around and say, let's all hold hands and do something about climate change. It just doesn't make sense. And it's I think an attempt to kind of appease a lot of different stakeholders who have some varied interests when it comes to this area. And it's also this sort of typical, one of the things that is a constant in U.S. foreign policy, the inability to see U.S. actions from another perspective and perceive how, the Chinese government might view, export controls that are, trying to destroy the Chinese chip industry. And they might not, if we impose those things, they might not be willing to turn around and say, okay, well, we don't like that you did that, but let's work together on these other things anyway. The U.S. foreign policy establishment has always been very bad about kind of strategic empathy, it's often called, just sort of the ability to step outside of ourselves and see our actions from another country's perspective. And I think that's part of this as well.
And then, I mean, I think to circle back to the point, it reflects in general the kind of schizophrenia amongst the American ruling classes about China, which is both feared and also desired as a object of exploitation as well. So they just don't know whether they're coming or going, because all these huge commercial industries are so dependent on them having this ongoing relationship. And so, like, what are you going to do if you suddenly cut off the supply of bicycles to Walmart or whatever it is? And of course, I mean, I would note that the Democrats I'm in Missouri right now, and we have some pathetic Democrat running for the Senate here. What is the advert they're running on YouTube in Missouri all the time? That Republicans are selling Missouri lands to China. If they wanted to sell land to communists, they should have become a broker in China. Like Eric Schmidt is a communist. And this is the Democratic Party campaign, and we're seeing the political establishments in the Democratic Party actually engaging a lot, in some ways, like even heavier red baiting, even more hostility towards the left than you're seeing. I mean, you see the usual crazy hostility from Republicans, but there's really an uptick in a kind of like anti-communism, the aligning of Russia with socialism and communism in the context of the war. And the Democrats are becoming increasingly a more vociferous war party in the Congress and the executive branch.
Gene, you've been watching a lot of MSNBC, haven't you?
This is my morning. Like I listen to Joe Scarborough and his girlfriend in the morning, and they, have a procession of blathering idiots coming on their show. And it's not just that. I mean, like, it's the woke imperialism, isn't it? Like, they're doing all the same, like, protests in Cuba are led by Afro-Latinos, and, this kind of red baiting that's always going on. But it's coming from the progressive side in a very, thick and heavy way. And, we're seeing both Democrats and Republicans emphasizing different enemies, perhaps. I think definitely the Democrats are more hostile towards Russia, and the Republicans are more hostile towards China, but they're both hostile to both powers, at least in their discourse. I mean, what are your thoughts on that, Derek?
I think there was a resorting in some ways under the Trump administration, and a lot of things became more partisan than they had been previously. I think the Saudi relationship is one of those things. Really, there was like a visceral reaction among Democrats to the relationship that he had with the Saudis, and Russia was a huge one. Obviously, I mean, the Russiagate story going all the way back to the 2016 campaign, and then this perception that he was doing Vladimir Putin's bidding for 4 years. It really changed the nature of the debate about these issues in DC and on cable news, certainly in interesting ways. And I don't know that we've fully figured that all out. I mean, I talked to a couple of, I talked to Danny about this. I was on Bob Wright's podcast several weeks ago, and we talked about this. It's I think it's a shakeup in foreign policy discourse that's akin to the kind of resorting that happened around the Iraq War, when you had this really sudden rise of the sort of restrainer community that gets talked about a lot, that broke down on partisan lines. I mean, it was people who were opposed to George W. Bush viewed the war in Iraq as unjustified, rightly so in my opinion, opposed it, and then kind of were able from there to just decide that they opposed U.S. foreign policy more broadly, and sort of opposed we're supportive of this broader concept of restraint. I think some of that is being tested now, and that's why the discourse seems to be a little bit in flux, because Trump adopted a lot of the rhetoric of restraint without actually doing any restraint. I mean, he talked about some things that you could say were from a restrainer perspective. He didn't actually put any of them into practice, and then adding to that the way that Russia is now perceived in a very partisan way, and the invasion of Ukraine is being viewed in a partisan way. I think you have some people who didn't like George W. Bush, didn't like the Iraq War, decided that meant they didn't like interventionist foreign policy in general, rethinking some of those assumptions now.
I think this is a really important point. I think during the 2000s, we had the rise of the quote unquote anti-war movement, right? But, something like being anti-war, you can read different things into that. And I think a lot of the kind of middle class left base saw anti-war as a kind of principled argument against war and intervention. Whereas perhaps for some of the foreign policy establishment, it wasn't like a point of principle per se, but rather that this was a wrong war in terms of it was sold to people on a false premise, and B, it was the wrong imperial strategy, that America shouldn't be expending those resources. That's certainly what I see with Obama being able to recuperate that anti-war feeling amongst broad sections of the American population. And what I see today is a similar kind of recuperation where quote-unquote anti-fascism has become the ideological rubric for both the Democratic Party domestically, that they're fighting a war against the Republicans who are fascists, and also in terms of framing their foreign policy, that they're fighting an anti-fascist war in the Ukraine, and that if you question the narrative on Ukraine, question about how far you can go, you're basically capitulating to fascism. You're redoing the appeasement of the 1930s as well. And just as anti-war served this role for the Democratic Party in the 2000s in a flagging Republican administration, this rubric of anti-fascism in a deeper way is ingraining itself and drawing together the threads of American domestic politics and American international politics on the Democratic side of the American political establishment. Would you say that's kind of a fair assessment, or am I being way too conspiratorial about that?
No, I think that's very fair. I mean, it's there is definitely I mean, I think about this more in terms of the foreign policy angle than the domestic side, but certainly, I mean, you can see in the way the Democrats have tried to govern these last couple of years, and the way that they have approached the midterms. It's very much like, we let's not talk so much about the issues. I mean, there's a couple that we want to talk about, abortion, for example, in the wake of the Supreme Court ruling. But really what we want to talk about is democracy is under attack, and the Republicans are, undermining democracy. And that's the issue, the great issue of our time. The Biden administration clearly seems to view the war in Ukraine as a similar kind of sorting mechanism. It is, they view it as the new great conflict of our time, and you're either on the right side or the wrong side. And if you're on the wrong side, well, then that's you're gonna at least face some rhetorical anger from the U.S., if not any kind of substantive punishment. But there's definitely a movement to demand that countries, even countries that have nothing to do with Russia or Ukraine, couldn't have less to do with, or countries whose only interaction with, it's made it impossible to import food and support, kind of feed their populations. All these countries are expected to take a side. You have to pick a side, and that's why you get a lot of the kind of anguished rhetoric about what's countries in Africa, why aren't they coming, why aren't they seeing that what Russia's done is evil, and why don't they support the sanctions regime and what the US is trying to do, what the West is trying to do. And it's again, it's partly an inability to just kind of step back and say, what are these other countries, what interest do they have in taking sides in this conflict? What would be the point of that for them? All they again, for a lot of them, the only interaction they really have with that war is that they were dependent on grain shipments from Ukraine and Russia, and now those grain shipments have been severely impeded. But it's just sort of a I don't know. It is a weird kind of they view it as a sort of great divide in geopolitics, and everybody's expected to be on one side of it or the other. Even countries that really don't seem to have much of a rooting interest in that sense.
It's absolutely absurd the way liberals are going to liberal. They're going to reduce everything to a very, very kind of like, ridiculous kind of Manichaean kind of good bad dichotomy in order to facilitate them, getting their contingency into buying into their principles on an unprincipled basis. So it's not surprising that they're painting this with this broad brush to deny any kind of nuance from the consciousness of their supporters, and it just makes the conversation and the ability to politically educate people even harder and even worse.
I think that's a really important point. I mean, to kind of thread back to my point about anti-fascism, Putin is really the figure that threads the domestic and the foreign policy. He's the big foreign policy bad guy, but also he's like the person behind Trumpism and the far right. And, everybody's heard of Alexander Dugin. And, there's some validity to the fact that the Russians attempt to influence American public opinion. Everybody does it. You just open up a TV channel and try to influence public opinion in the United States. But I think the sorting mechanism is extremely important because the mainstream narrative has, pitched this as a moral battle. And of course, the Ukrainians are far more sympathetic. And it's not just about, oh, they're white people, that's why they're sympathetic. Like, people didn't give a crap about the Yugoslavians, and they were all white. They're sympathetic because the Russians invaded their country. And you could talk about, like, Maidan, and America did this, and America did that. But the end of the day is Vladimir Putin escalated the conflict to a new level of violence and conflict. And people see that, and they're like, oh, this is like a bad invasion of a country. Countries should have their own freedom to do what they want internally. Blah, 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 blah. So they can, the moral argument on the face of it is like really like a plausible, visceral, emotional one. A big country invaded a little country, and, you could talk about the history. And I think the problem with the debate is it becomes, you either have this, and we see this on the left, like the Ukraine war has been a really interesting sorting mechanism for the kind of Bernie Sanders base, the journalists, the activists, where, the Ukraine war sorted between those who, in the wake of Bernie Sanders' defeat, well, they rallied behind Ukraine. They had all the Ukraine flags. They were in favor of arming Ukraine. And then you had a kind of reaction to this, which is not really a transcending or deeper understanding of the principle. It just becomes an inversion. So whatever the liberal establishment say is true, you believe the opposite. So if the Americans are doing propaganda, you don't believe anything Americans say, but you believe everything that the Russians say, or you take Russian sources as being, more honest than American sources. When in reality, it's like, what's the point of anyone having a side in this conflict? We should just want it to end. Like, we don't want, we're heading towards, I don't think we're going to have a nuclear war, but, this is having all kinds of unfortunate knock-on effects. And, moralizing this conflict is not going to resolve the conflict. You have to make peace with your enemies. You don't make peace with your friends. And somehow the best outcome would seem to be peace with Ukraine. What that peace looks like, I don't really know. But there is a really hardening attempt by liberals and some elements of the left to frame this as a kind of moral conflict, an anti-fascist conflict, and any sort of discussion of negotiation.
They hate Putin and see Putin as being the ideological progenitor of the reactionary right in Europe and the West. And if they can stomp him out like a cockroach, you don't have to worry about the right wing.
Yeah, I certainly think that's. And then on the flip side, you just have a whole bunch of a smaller group of people who call themselves anti-imperialists, who just invert the moral universe, turn it on its head, but still have that same moral universe. There's like, so you have people like, well, Putin's actually the good guy. Russia Russia had to do this because America took all these actions. It's like, well, even if Russia was worried, like, why do I care what the Russian state is scared of? Everybody's scared of something. I'm sure Americans were all scared of, like, I'm sure there were tons of people in the American establishment who were legitimately fearing in their emotional self that terrorism was going to affect them after 9/11. That doesn't justify being scared or being concerned. Doesn't justify, massive escalations. Yeah, massive escalations. It's like, well, feelings are feelings. I'm sorry you feel that way. I'm sorry Russia feels bad that, things happened in Ukraine, but that doesn't justify an escalation. But like on the flip side, an unending conflict, where does it end? Russia is a nuclear armed power. Do we really want to do we really want to escalate to an exceptional extent that?
Well, the question is, I mean, listen, man, all of this depends on what you believe the role of NATO is in this endeavor. There's some people who are like, listen, these NATO bastards have been aggravating this situation by expanding into former Russian territory, and they pushed Russians to a position where they were like, if the U.S. was in a similar situation, they would do the exact goddamn same thing. And my position is that, and this is why I've always made it clear when it distinguishes my plan. I don't support NATO expansionism anywhere. NATO shouldn't even exist anymore. But I also think that the realpolitik of the Russians attacking Ukraine in this particular moment was absolutely absurd, because look at the condition of where the world was. About right after COVID, right after 3 years of people being locked down, the world is miserable, and you're going to take this opportunity to go into a global conflagration over Ukraine? Come on, man. It didn't strike me as a sound strategic move to be pushing to this degree, and I felt that the existential NATO threat could have been diverted in other ways. That was not something that could not have been neutralized.
I think there were definitely opportunities missed to forestall this war. I don't know that those opportunities were in January or February of this year, but going back to 2014, over the past 8 years, there were chances to create a set of conditions in Ukraine that would have, assuaged, I think, Russian concerns before things got to where they are now. I agree, Pascal, with you completely. NATO should not exist. I mean, it just shouldn't exist. It shouldn't even be an issue at this point. But NATO, again, I mean, like U.S. foreign policy, NATO is an organization that has been in search of a mission for the last 30 years or 32 years. And they're just going to keep trying on different hats until they find one that fits. Gene, I also agree with you. The moralizing this conflict to me is just so unfortunate. I mean, it leaving aside the effect it has on sort of talking about this in a forum, whether it's on social media or wherever, just completely pointless, because you're either going to be called a bad guy for supporting Russia, or a bad guy for supporting Ukraine, or whatever. When you cast a conflict like this in those terms, it closes off the space for negotiation. I mean, how's the Ukrainian government supposed to negotiate with Russia when Vladimir Putin is the font of all evil? How is Russia supposed to negotiate with Ukraine when Ukraine is, apparently full of Nazis, and everything that happens in Ukraine is an existential threat to Russia? When you cast in these maximalist, moralist terms, it prevents negotiating an end to the conflict, which, as you said, Gene, is what everybody should be trying to get to, is an end to the conflict. What that looks like, that's for the combatants to decide, I suppose. But what everybody should be hoping for is that it ends in some fashion.
No doubt.
Yeah, I mean that. Yeah, it's a real tragedy, and I just want to address something. We always look at this military endeavor as being a function of Russian foreign policy, but foreign policy and domestic foreign policy are interconnected to each other. And one of the characteristics of emerging economies, places like Russia, places like Turkey, their military expansion overseas is often not only related to their foreign policy concerns, but related to dynamics within their own country, instability within their own country, the search for new markets for their like growing capitalist classes. So when we look at the causes of these wars, people can repeat at me like America has 800 military bases and NATO did this. It's like, that's all great, but these conflicts are all overdetermined by a host of factors, and reducing it to a kind of moral fight, whether you're like Russia is a progressive power fighting against American imperialism, or whether you're saying that we're engaged in a fight against the new fascism, that does not elucidate anything, and that does not get anyone closer to a solution. And like, frankly, because the left is so far from power, we don't need to take a side in this, right? We're so far from power. It's like, we can like say like a plague on all this war. This war is horrible and it's costing humans lives. There's like horrible people on both sides of the conflict. Russia attacked, obviously not without, I mean, like when you're at school, when I was at school in England and I was doing history, we learned that like one of the reasons Hitler engaged in imperialism was because they were treated so badly at the treaties of Versailles. Does that mean my history teacher was a Nazi sympathizer because they were talking about the harsh treatment meted out on Germany in the Treaty of Versailles at the end of the First World War? No, but it's like provides context, right? So people are really silly about this, and it's really unfortunate that a rational discussion of like how to get the hell out of a very brutal conflict cannot be engaged in. But I realize we're going over time, Derek. We're stealing your time. So I want to thank you for coming on.
Sure,
is there anything
for having me.
Anything you want to plug?
Well, people can check out American Prestige. That's the show I host with Danny Bessner, AmericanPrestigePod.com, or wherever you get your podcasts. And Foreign Exchanges is at fx.substack.com. That's my newsletter. Yeah, those that's it.
Hopefully
I don't have anything else going on.
Hopefully we'll be getting some of the people from Foreign Policy Exchanges on the show, because there's some really great articles in there. If you have not subscribed to it, make sure you subscribe to Foreign Policy Exchanges. Pascal, anything to plug? Anything we should be aware of? Anything I'm forgetting?
Don't forget that Jason is going to be on Majority Report on Friday, as a matter of fact. And don't forget, we're going to have the live show. It's going to be on October 23rd, I believe. Right?
Yeah, Sunday, October the 23rd at the Teragram Ballroom in LA. You can buy tickets at events. You can even walk up and buy a ticket on the day. Danny will be there on the panel of doom. He'll be with, I think he's with Deep State Cuba, and he's also with C. Derek Vaughn, who are probably the two other gloomiest people in the universe. Although Danny maintains a chipper, stiff upper lip while he's giving you the doom.
Yeah, he has a good attitude about it all, even if it's
he's winning at life.
The content is not great.
The content's not great, but he's winning at life. So, he can be jolly about it. But yeah, so links to all that are in the description. You can check the tickets out there, information on there. People, calm down on Twitter, no need to be mean about guests at the show. It's a show. It's for entertainment. This is Revolution is about education and entertainment. We do not pretend we are cyber-Leninists and we're going to lead you to proletarian revolution. So don't get mad about everything. Everybody just chill out. And with that said, consider buying some of our merch. There we go. Look at that. Look at us. Look at us recuperating for capitalism. Pictures of Marx and Lenin. We're doing it like you see. We get the Afro-pessimism teacher. So consider buying some merch, because, people doing this stuff costs money. People have to live. And with that, Pascal, would you like to say the magic words? Not the white ones.
All out.